On behalf of Isentia and all of our panelists today, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and the traditional custodians of the land where we work, where we live, and where we're meeting from today. Many of us are joining you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation or from Wurundjeri country. To those traditional owners and to those custodians, we pay our respects. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and we also really acknowledge the enduring connection to the land and the strength that they have. All right, good morning, good afternoon, kia ora, hello to everybody who is joining this session today. This is our final Isentia webinar of the year, so I'm looking forward to it a lot, and we have the best panel assembled today to discuss digital storytelling for social change. It's going to be awesome. But before we get into it, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. So for everybody that is joining the panel, you'll note that your microphone has been muted. This isn't because we don't want to hear from you today. We desperately want to hear your feedback. We've got time to answer your questions. We're interested in your thoughts on what we're discussing. We just want to minimize that background noise. So we do have time at the end for those questions, which you'll be able to direct to our panelists, who I'll introduce you to in a second. But the place to go to ask your questions is to look for the question mark icon on the right-hand side of your screen. So there should be a question mark there and a speech bubble. And on that speech bubble, that is where you'll be able to enter anything into the chat area as well. I think that is most of that housekeeping out of the way, and now feels like an excellent time to introduce you to our panel. And if I haven't met you before, my name is Ali and I am the CX Director at Isentia, and I will be facilitating this conversation today. And let's talk about who our panelists are. We've got a big topic ahead of us, looking back at COP26, talking about climate and the way that stories about climate are being told in the media, and also hoping that everybody who attends this session today is able to come away with some really practical tips about what successful campaigns look like and how we enact social change using digital stories. So for that, we have assembled this panel where we have a wealth of experience in areas like journalism, activism, campaigning, comms, media research and evaluation. And I just said lots of different words there. So it means that lots of our panelists wear different hats, which is going to be so valuable to the conversation. So I'd like to introduce you to Marc Daalder, who's the Senior Political Reporter at Newsroom NZ. And Marc's beat includes things like COVID-19, climate change, energy, primary industries in the far right. And Marc is joining us from Wellington and Aotearoa, New Zealand. So thank you so much for being here today, Marc.
Thank you for having me.
We're delighted. We also have Sally Rugg with us today, and Sally is an activist, a digital campaigner, an author, and a speaker. Sally has lots of experience to draw from today. Recently, she has been the executive director at change.org, so she has helped thousands of Australians be able to advocate for social change through that collective online action. Sally's also worked at the forefront of the marriage equality campaign in Australia at her time there for a campaign director at GetUp, which she wrote about for her award-winning book, How Powerful We Are. Thank you so much for being here, Sally.
Thank you. I don't think my book has won an award, but I'm happy to add that to the introduction.
It's won my awards.
Thank you. I like to say it's critically acclaimed because I've had some really good feedback, but hasn't won an award.
See, I thought it had, but maybe I just made that up because it felt to me like it should have won an award. But congratulations on your critically acclaimed book, and we'll dig into that today because I know it's been referred to as a blueprint for campaigns and how to get change going. We also have Nevena Spirovska on the panel today. So Nevena is somebody else who also brings so much experience. So she is a community advocate and she works in comms, PR, and media. And Nevena has dedicated herself to that for-purpose work of community advocacy. And she is really engaged with movements like climate justice, but also looking at equity for LGBTIQA+ people as well. And now I'm definitely going to have to look at my notes for this bit, but currently she is the co-convenor of the Victorian Pride Lobby, board member of Thorn Harbour Health, advisor to GetUp Australia, and an organiser with the National Homeless Collective. So thank you, Nevena, for joining us this morning.
The pleasure is all mine. Thanks, Sally.
No worries. Rounding out the panel today, we have Amy Parry, who is an insights lead at Access Intelligence. And Amy is a media measurement and evaluation expert, and she has got over a decade's worth of experience of providing best practice analysis frameworks and analysis service to some of the world's largest and most complex organizations. And Amy is part of the research and insights leadership team at Access Intelligence. And of course, Access Intelligence is Icentia's new parent company. And having Amy join us for this conversation today, it represents the kind of conversations that we're able to have going forward as part of that Access Intelligence family, looking at something global like COP and being able to zero in on that in domestic or local narratives as well. So thank you, Amy, for being here. And I know it's really late in your day, so we really appreciate it.
Super excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, everybody, you're all excited and grateful to be here. So let's get into the questions, I reckon. I've got so much that I want to talk to you about today for our audience. And I want to start by looking back at COP26. Amy, I've mentioned that that's something that you've been working on, but we also have Marc today. So I'll come to you shortly. But what I wanted to start by asking is, Marc, for Newsroom, how did you approach covering COP? What were your goals? What were you thinking about as the reporter who's covering climate?
Yeah, I think when you cover something like COP, there are, I guess, three things that I have in mind. One of them is that, you know, there are stories that have a New Zealand angle that we want to convey to our audience in New Zealand, and those are sort of, I guess, the bread and butter of what I do already. So it's the stuff that I find easiest. Then there is sort of figuring out which of the stories that don't necessarily have a New Zealand specific angle are worth writing about anyways because of the global importance. And obviously at COP, you have lots of stuff that maybe New Zealand isn't involved in, but has a huge sort of impact on climate change. So picking and choosing that is important. And it helped that we had a reporter in Glasgow as well, helping cover that sort of side of things. And then thirdly is just sort of, I guess this is less about covering COP, but about moving past COP, keeping in mind that, you know, COP, particularly COP26 is important, but that it is not, you know, climate change was happening beforehand, and climate change and climate policy will continue to be just as important afterwards, and making sure that we don't cover climate as a sort of occasional story, once a year type story, when it should be sort of all the time.
Absolutely. And how do you think you did with that? If that was what you were trying to do, how did it go for you?
I think we did pretty well, particularly at Newsroom. You know, we're a sort of smaller independent publication, and I think we sort of punched above our weight, and probably as a percentage of our overall coverage in those 2 weeks, climate was, you know, very high. It was probably the thing we wrote about the most, and perhaps in absolute numbers, we may have written more about climate and about COP than some of the bigger New Zealand publications as well. I think broadly the New Zealand media did pretty well as well, but I think they do tend to fall into that trap of, you know, covering climate at COP and then waiting until there's another sort of thing to tie your climate coverage to, whether that's an IPCC report or a government announcement, but it sort of falls by the wayside in between.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that you've touched on volumes there, like volumes of coverage, and that being something that can be tied to an incident, but it's also ongoing. Amy, as somebody who has literally just come up for air after analysing COP26 across traditional and social, how does some of what Marc is saying resonate for what you've seen across those media trends?
Yeah, I think during the sort of COP26 time period, there were some fairly obvious things that we point out from our research. For example, you know, each country reported more so on their own policies and their own leaders. But I think in generally speaking, news media also largely followed the COP26 agenda, and news stories didn't really fall outside of this a great deal. On the whole, I think countries sort of backed policies made by their own leaders. So, for example, with India almost defending its pledge to be net zero by 2070 instead of some of the earlier goals. In some ways, to be honest, the exception here was in Australia, where the reporting was a bit more critical, it's especially around things like Scott Morrison, who I've recently learned you guys call ScoMo. I recently, which was new to me, Bojo ScoMo, makes total sense, where he was accused of being a liar in the discussion about him refusing to pledge against the methane emissions. Going there to what has already been said.
Amy, you're
I think,
just breaking up a
the
little
individual
bit
countries
for
took a lot more interest in their own policies, and I think that's quite natural. But what we found was that.
Oh, well, it looks like we have lost Amy. Sally, I might.
Can you guys still hear me?
I can hear you now, but based on what you've said about Australia being that exception to some of the coverage trends that we're seeing, Sally, I might throw to you. How is that resonating to you and what you have seen about COP coverage in Australia? Like, who are you seeing that is setting that agenda?
Yeah, it was interesting. Both Marc and Amy, I think, like I'm nodding along furiously to all of your insights until Amy, you said that the most of the coverage had kind of reflected the agenda of COP across most countries. And in Australia, I think I think we were the exception because I noticed so much of the media coverage being about French President Emmanuel Macron calling Scott Morrison a liar about the submarines deal. And like I watched that press conference, ABC's, I think it was Andrew Probyn bailed up the president and sort of, yeah, got this sort of like really spicy interview out of him. And it was like great current affairs content. But I also remember as COP was playing, it's just like the headline of every bulletin and the front page of every story was like, you know, Emmanuel Macron has shirt fronted Scott Morrison. And meanwhile, so I think that a lot of the media in Australia, I felt like was sort of chasing this story of conflict and drama and rather than sort of like talking about, as Marc mentioned, Amy mentioned, around like Australia's refusal to sign up to the methane pledge, for instance, you know, less sort of policy topics. And that is like, I think everybody on the panel will probably agree, well, perhaps not Marc, because it's not your job to campaign, Marc, but like trying to get stories in the media or in the public conversation around like policy, climate policy, and all that sort of wonky detailed stuff is quite difficult. It's much easier to engage an audience's attention if it's like, look at this fight at the conference, and that obviously, you know, in the way revenue streams work for media publications and networks work at the moment, like you need clicks and eyeballs, otherwise you won't keep publishing for very long. So yeah.
Nevena, I saw you furiously nodding as well, which might be a theme for the session today when Sally was talking about the difficulty of placing coverage or getting stories out there about policy. What was it that you were agreeing with there? Is that something you have experience on?
I have a lot of experience in media rejection, so specifically around trying to get a policy position into the media that might challenge a dominant narrative, But in being a campaigner, media is just one tactic that we can use to speak to our persuadables or speak to our base. So that furious agreement came from recognizing that difficulty, but also recognizing how important it is to speak to beyond the people who are currently in our network and try to break through into a larger audience, especially if they might be in opposition to the message, the policy position, the campaign that we're a part of.
Amazing. So when you are working on those campaigns, is media coverage always your top goal? Like, how do you approach goal setting for your campaign and your community advocacy work?
It's always in our top three because, as we mentioned, it allows us the opportunity to not only fire up our base, to speak to our persuadables, but to speak beyond our network. We really want to be engaging in an audience that goes beyond the one that we currently have, with the goal of movement building, coalition building, and bringing power to our campaign.
Amazing. Amy, I'm so glad we've got you back. It's fabulous to see your face again. Now that we've got you, we've listened a little bit to Sally and Nevena talk about that campaigning perspective. From the media research and the evaluation that you've been doing, what have you been seeing in terms of influence around some of those narratives around COP26 or climate coverage in general? Like, who is driving that? What is the relationship between online activists and the coverage we see in a more traditional media space?
So I think specifically relating to COP26, the next point I was going to make before my internet decided it was the end of a very long day for me, was that the news media were really factual in nature during that time. And as I was kind of saying there, very much stuck to the news agenda is a lot of what we were seeing. So when it came to reporting on sort of online activism and digital campaigns, I'd say that the news media commented more so on the activists themselves, or on movement themselves, and maybe some of their actions rather than their policies. I think it was here that there was the most significant crossover between social media and traditional media. Whereby the trends that we saw were that the conversation generally started on social media from activist groups and was reported on by news media when it started trending, because like I said, it didn't really fall out of that news agenda. There was so much going on at COP26, and I think that unless something really scandalous happened, activists weren't always at the forefront of conversation. But that being said, they were mentioned in probably nearly every single piece of coverage relating to COP26. With the Greenpeace and Extinction Rebellion, for example, being really visible throughout the entire period and dominating share of voice. So really, I think it depends on what the goal is here. If it was to be seen and considered and to raise awareness of the groups and of the activists themselves, then that was certainly achieved, you know, as a broad group, not the individual sort of organisations themselves. But in order to sustain what each movement was actually saying in more detail, I think the media agenda was already too busy, and this is something that needs to be sustained after the conference. You know, it's, you know, lots of people were saying COP26 isn't just limited to a 2-week period. You know, it's something that we need to keep continuing to talk about, and I think that's where that online activism and those digital campaigns will really come into play. When we're thinking about evaluation, the goals we often first start with are quite often looking at whether it's a question of quantity or quality. And during COP26, I think there was definitely a lot of quantity, but because of the focus of the media agenda, there wasn't always a lot of quality pieces.
Yeah, amazing.
Sally,
That's interesting. Go for it, Sally.
Sorry, I was just hoping to jump in with a yes and, if that's okay. Amy, I think that insight is so fascinating. Sort of like, sure, these stunts or protests are sort of, they're getting in the media, but what are they actually doing beyond that? And I was thinking, on Nevena's answer as well about how like your top three sort of tactical goals for a campaign is often to get in the media, because the media has such a powerful role in spreading your message and if you're lucky, setting the agenda for the day. And it's interesting to me as an activist how sort of like public demonstrations or marches or protests nowadays are so often like one of the primary goals of those demonstrations is to get in the media. So like, you know, you'll see stunts where, you know, everybody's dressing up a certain way, or we've built this huge prop, or we're doing it here with this big billboard or whatever. It's sort of like visual stunts, or it's, you know, a lot of the, here in Victoria, a lot of the protests on Saturdays that have been happening that are protesting COVID adjacent things. It's like sort of like vaccines, lockdowns, not sure, but it's sort of like the goal of those sorts of protests is to try and get media attention. But historically, you know, thinking about activist theory and you know, struggle theory, historically marches and protests were nothing to do with the media. It was about demonstrating a threat. So if you think about the teachers and nurses who are striking today in New South Wales, for folks in Sydney, you might have had your commute to work this morning disrupted a little. And so the purpose of that march isn't to get media attention. I mean, that's probably a byproduct, but the purpose of those sorts of march is to demonstrate like the sheer volume of workers in a labour force, and you know, it's a strike. And so I just think it is interesting how activists like Nevena and I have sort of like taken those sort of traditional labour marches, labour meaning you know, labour union, and like they have become tactics to get in the media as well. And yeah, it's just an interesting perhaps observation, or perhaps it's not an interesting observation, in which case I've just derailed the conversation.
Interesting observation, definitely haven't derailed, is that you've started to talk a little bit about some of those tools that activists have in their toolkit and that digital campaigners have in their toolkit, which there is a significant overlap for many of the people on this call today who might be working in PR and comms or a not-for-profit space, or also consider themselves campaigners. So I definitely want to make sure that we talk about some of those tools today and how those stories are told and how they're measured. So I thought I might jump to you, Nevena, and talk a little bit about some of those tools that you have used as part of your Climate 5 work. For people who aren't familiar with what you've done in that space, would you be able to run through like, what have you done? What are the platforms that you use, and what has that success looked like?
Absolutely. So Climate 5 put forward 5 simple steps for climate action, and it was born out of the Black Summer bushfire catastrophe. In putting that campaign together, we recognize that donations can be incredibly effective at helping to rebuild affected communities. But in the short term, we really wanted to find a way to direct collective consumer action to shift us away from our country's reliance on coal and other polluting industries. So if you can put yourself back into that horrible moment we found ourselves in, so many of us were overwhelmed with everything that was happening around us. And so my friend and I, in putting this campaign together, we set up an Instagram page, so that being our primary digital tool. And the 5 steps that we wanted people to complete were paying the rent, which was recognizing that climate change is a direct result of colonization. We wanted people to consider switching super funds to those that didn't invest in fossil fuels, switching to 100% renewable energy, switching a business to 100% renewable energy, and switching to 100% recycled toilet paper. And while that may seem, you know, a little bit trivial, I always reflect on the fact that only about 5% of this country is using recycled toilet paper, and that, you know, that is so just such a minimal such a bare minimum thing that we can do. But really what we were wanting to direct people is, instead of inaction, into 5 simple actions that they could do in less than 5 minutes. So in measuring and evaluating our campaign, the reason we used Instagram, because at the time and right now it is a very popular information and campaign platform. We were able to build an organic following from 0 to a couple of thousand in a short period of time. And by our tracking, in the first month, we shifted approximately $2 million from super funds that were investing in fossil fuels to divest to super funds that weren't. We were able to push Coles Supermarket to commit to 100% being powered by renewable energy. So it was taking that catastrophic moment. It was using the digital tool that so many of us are connected on. It was inspiring action through very simple steps. And then through good design, we were able to get this shared frequently and build that little movement in the moment, where we directed people from a passive passive action of sending funds to collective consumer action.
Yeah, amazing. What's really coming through for me there is the simplicity to help people in a moment when they are overwhelmed. So being really targeted in this space around what you're asking people to do. We've been talking about activism and campaigning for a little while. Marc, I wanted to swing back to you, because I know we have activists on the panel today, but for somebody who is the senior political reporter, I've seen you be, or heard you on a podcast, be quite critical of some of the climate coverage that you have seen in New Zealand. And something that you said that really stuck with me is that, yeah, you're covering climate for Newsroom, but every reporter should be a climate reporter. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on that for me.
Yeah, definitely. It's not my idea to start with. I found in Emily Atkins's very good newsletter called Heated. But the general gist, right, is that climate is something that touches every aspect of our lives, right? So, you have a business team, and you have a lifestyle team, and you have a politics team, and a breaking news team, and you have someone who'll go out and report on a natural disaster, and you have someone who spends all their time reporting on state-owned entities. And all of these sorts of things have some relation to climate change. Generally, it will be both affected by the impacts of climate change and a role in mitigating climate change and sort of engaging in climate policy to reduce emissions. But sometimes it's just one of those or just the other. But either way, it's hard to think of a journalist who doesn't cover something that is affected by climate change. I mean, I sort of draw the connection to COVID, where, in New Zealand, at least, you'd be hard pressed to find a journalist who doesn't know what contact tracing is and can give you a pretty good explanation of how it works. And almost every single person who knows that now did not know it 2 years ago. And climate change, so the basics of climate change and the basics of climate policy should be just as universal, because, you need to know that sort of stuff if you're going to be writing about the world. And if the job of journalists is to sort of explain why things are happening and to tell their audiences the truth, well, climate change is increasingly a sort of major part of that truth, regardless of whether you're reporting on business or on a storm.
Absolutely. Amy, how does that resonate with you, like with what you're seeing around the way coverage of climate is changing? Is this idea that every reporter should be a climate reporter something that you're seeing reflected more broadly? What are you seeing?
It's a really good question, and I think it depends on what you refer to as climate. If we look at the amount of times that climate or climate change is mentioned over a period of a few years, which we have done across traditional and social media, this would always show that it's increasing in coverage, that the mentions of those particular sort of general topics are increasing. However, it really depends on the angle, which I think relates back to what Marc is saying there, in that, everybody's reporting on it in some way. But, are they sort of focusing on it? Are they truly understanding kind of what is being mentioned? I think quite often it's being mentioned for sort of clicks and things like that as well. But I think it depends on the angle and what about climate really. We did an analysis for a big movement, a global movement, on media and political stakeholders on the topic of climate change, but more specifically land use. And the way we identified influential stakeholders was to analyse the land use topic in our traditional news archive and on social media channels to identify who the audience is and which stakeholders they interact with the most. When doing our research across our political services, our media and our research teams, we found that when looking at the climate change topic, it was really important to be as specific as possible when we were trying to identify actually what was being said within it and kind of what the trends are. For example, a trend line might show that the term climate change has massively increased over time on Twitter. But when you look into a lot of these tweets, you might get a lot of people tweeting climate change. Yeah, that was a genuine tweet that I saw when looking into some of those different themes within it. And it's not exactly meaningful. But when considering news media, I think there's a noise of a different variety. If we were to remove how much climate change coverage is driven by events or policies like COP26, I think the trend line would tell a very different story. I don't think there's so much sort of climate discussion that's being discussed proactively outside of a lot of those events that are being driven by the sort of news agenda, if you like.
No, that makes sense. And you've given me lots to reflect on, because I've realized just asking you, what's the coverage on climate is potentially not very helpful. Like, we can be covering climate, but are we covering climate change? How are we covering that? And what does that actually mean for equity or climate justice in this area? Like, they are two very different questions. Something that I'm keeping my eye on the time, so I want to pivot us a little bit. We'll be able to return to some of this climate change conversation when we're doing questions or at the end, but I also want to make sure that everybody who is attending today is able to take away some tips or some anecdotes or some stories around what it does look like in the digital campaigning space. Whether you are a PR person or a comms person, or you are thinking about how to tell stories. And Sally, I wanted to throw to you first on this one, and then I'll ask you for your thoughts as well, Nevena. So Sally, I know that you're currently working for Australians for Murdoch Royal Commission. Hopefully I've got that name right, but I know that you have just finished up at change.org. When I think about your time at change.org, you must have seen so many petitions, so many campaigns must have come across your desk. I'm going to ask you such a broad conversation and question. What did the successful ones have in common? Like, what did the best ones have in common?
That's actually like a very simple question, because we see it again and again. The generic answer is a personal story. You know, like it's less compelling to talk about the concentration of, you know, pollution parts per million in the atmosphere than it is to talk about a child's asthma. And how, you know, pollution levels in this particular area has seen, you know, all these kids get asthma. Or yeah, and it, you know, it's less compelling to talk about the science behind temperature rise around the Great Barrier Reef and bleaching events. I mean, I find that very interesting, than it is to sort of zone in on this tourism operator who's been, you know, family business for 100 years and he's about to go broke. You know, like, people are very moved by personal stories that cut the issue, is a campaigning term. But specifically with change.org, so change.org as a platform is, the model is basically anybody can start a petition on anything they care about, like, with some policy like policy rules like you might find on any social media platform. And the vast, well, a significant majority of people who start petitions that go on to become extraordinarily powerful and successful, and actually, like, a significant majority of all the petitions started full stop tend to be people, usually mothers, who have faced like the most unimaginable tragedy or injustice and have tried talking to their MP, they have tried going to the ombudsman, they've tried going to the regulator, they've tried speaking to a lawyer, you know, all the traditional avenues of justice or answers have let them down, and so they turn to the public essentially. And so, you know, in my 3.5 years there, as you know, the most successful campaigns were, you know, one led by Julianne Finney. She's just secured, along with other grieving mothers, the Royal Commission into veteran suicide. We also had Jane Seaholm, who was at the forefront of the campaign for the Royal Commission into aged care after she watched her mother be treated, you know, disgracefully and then lose her life under that system of neglect. So it's like, it's usually grieving women who, you know, whose child has died because this packet of biscuits doesn't have the allergen labelled correctly, or stories like that. Including the Home to Biloela campaign, which has been massive. And so it's not a grieving mother, but that campaign was started, it is run by a group of women who are, like, almost all of them are mothers, who watched their close friend and her husband and 2 little toddlers be swept up in the middle of the night by border force and put into detention. And so these women, you know, it's the same model essentially. And so I think there is something in that where, like, change.org can't take credit for that. Like, I don't take credit for that. Like, I think it is just a incredible truth that when women in particular, but all people, have faced extraordinary injustice and tragedy, people tend to not want that to happen to anybody else. And so much of social change and activism is driven by people who have experienced something terrible and don't want other people to have to live through what they've lived through. So, and the stories that sort of rise to the fore with climate change tend to follow that model as well. You know, it's people who've survived bushfires, people who are talking about losing their livelihoods, people who are talking about health outcomes for their children. It's those stories of human beings appealing to other human beings that this terrible thing won't happen to other human beings.
Absolutely. What you've said about the personal stories and change.org just being a platform for those personal stories to find other human beings is really fascinating. And I want to take this a little bit tactically for a second. So we've got a lot of people on the call who might be working for a not-for-profit or looking for tips that maybe they might be able to appeal to other human beings, but from a comms role rather than a campaigning role. Nevena, I know that you have worn multiple hats over your career and that you've got, put the other one on, you've got extensive experience in the PR and comms and strategic comms space as well. How does what Sally has said today apply to that style of work?
Sally has really captured what is at the heart of change, and whether we're trying to achieve this change through communications, through our media work, through PR work, through building coalitions, through building a movement, it really sits at the center. And in addition to that, what also that these successful comms campaigns have in common is having, as we would all say, a clear goal and a means to achieve and measure that goal. So if we can't do that, we're not going to be able to track and observe our impact. So whether that's 100,000 signatures on our change.org petition, whether that is 16 articles that we want placed across, 4 different mastheads, we really need to have that as in addition to the heart of our campaign. We would also love, in a communication sense and also as campaigners, to be able to build lateral relationships. So whether that's building relationships with journalists like Marc, so beyond times of crisis, when he's probably got 3 million emails, we can help be driving that news narrative or that news agenda for that day. It also means building lateral relationships with other communication people working in your sector, across your organization, in other adjacent businesses, so that you can make roundtables or networks that you can share information, have, I don't know, quarterly meetings if you aren't already, to really establish those relationships. So then when there is a moment of rapid information sharing or something that you have to respond to, it's much easier to text someone that you can say, hey, Sally, can you quickly help me with this? As opposed to, hi, Ellie, my name is Nevena. It's just having those relationships activated and ready to go in proactive ways, so we're not sitting in that reactive space, which we often are as communicators. And as communicators and working in comms, we also want to have a communication strategy ready and available that's succinct, that is a prescriptive blueprint for the work that we're doing, so that people who come into our team, people who are coming into this comms campaign that we might be working on, can pick it up and understand what our channels are, what our key messages are, what our target audience is, what we do and don't say, and implementing guides to be able to run that work without having to check in. So thinking about how quickly work can change over and how can we be better prepared for it.
Amazing. Amy, I've seen you do some furious nodding during this section. It's been your turn to do the head movement of the panel. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what you were agreeing with there, particularly in that measurement space. So what would your advice be to somebody who is looking to measure that campaign work or the comms campaign that they're working on?
Yeah, I was nodding furiously there at what Nevena was saying was music to my ears in terms of, measuring against goals and setting your goals at the beginning as well, not just afterwards going, well, how was that, and not really having anything to benchmark it against. And I think it also goes beyond traditional evaluation, looking at outputs and looking at, how many pieces of coverage are achieved. That's great. But actually, we need to level up and say, well, actually, did we achieve those 100,000 signatures through the work of communications, or wiser than PR and just as an organization as a whole, and considering were the organizational objectives achieved as well. So that was mainly why I was furiously nodding throughout that. And I think the key thing in terms of sort of successful campaigns and measurement around that is to use analysis to your advantage during all aspects of the campaign. Lots of people think that measurement and evaluation is all about looking at events retrospectively. And to be honest, in a lot of cases, we are looking at data that's retrospective. However, data can be used to target ahead of a campaign too. Outside of this sector, but one of the big European banks that we work for have been particularly successful with this. Ahead of their ESG campaign, they took the time to understand the current state of the media landscape around this topic. And through doing that, we were able to identify what the current messages were around that topic at the moment, which journalists and which media were already talking about it. So, the ones that might have interest in it. Who was leading that conversation and what events were driving that conversation. And ultimately, ahead of their campaign, they learned which media to target, which messages would land well, and what the response had been to different communications tactics. In addition to using the data ahead of campaigns as well, we can use the data throughout the campaign to see how things are going, because whilst it would be lovely to sort of say, right, this is what we're going to do and this is how it's all going to pan out, sometimes things outside of our control don't always go to plan. And so, using that data throughout the campaign allows communications teams to adapt their strategy to what's going on. One of my favourite anecdotes was more around sort of a product, but they found that in a particular country they were being criticised a lot more, and it's because they had a slightly different version of that product in the country, and so they just sort of quickly changed it, upgraded it for the same one as what everyone else had, and that negativity sort of quickly diminished. And then that leads us to, of course, the final kind of key part of measuring a successful campaign, and that's to reflect backwards, kind of what everybody probably does, but not just to say, okay, did we achieve our KPIs or not, but to learn from it and learn what went well, what didn't go so well, and what can be improved next time as well.
Definitely. I just wanted to take a moment to remind everybody that we are heading into shortly, I've got a couple more questions up my sleeve, to the section of this webinar today where you'll be able to ask our panelists any questions that you have. So feel free to look for that question mark icon, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen, and enter any questions that you have in there. And I'll do my best to get to all of those that come up today. Marc, I wanted to get your thoughts while we're waiting for any amazing questions that come in on what Nevena was saying before around the importance of that relationship between the comms person and journalists. How do you see that relationship for you, particularly when you are tackling some of these issues like climate change or injustice or COVID? Have I got you, Marc?
Sorry, I think I froze just at the end there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. How does that question around the relationship that you might have with comms people or campaigners feel to you as a political reporter?
Yeah, I think that's that sort of relationship is really helpful, and like Nevena said, just being able to ring someone up, on the spot when you have a question or you need sort of comment for a story, or even it's not uncommon for me to be digging into some document or some sort of highly technical issue and just ring someone up for a sense check, because it's tough just being the only person who has a sight of a story or an idea before you actually run it, and just wanting to be like, is this interesting? Is this news? What do you make of this? And so sort of developing those sorts of relationships are very helpful on my side, and I imagine it's very helpful on the side of the sort of on the other side as well. And I think it does also mean that if people have something that they want to run by me, I'll be able to take a look at it and consider writing about it.
Absolutely. Sally, I wanted to ask your thoughts on something. So this is a question that keeps coming up in these conversations, that for people who are looking to tell stories or to connect with audiences, but they have a really tight budget or they've got limited resources, what are the tools that should be in somebody's toolkit for converting those personal stories into stories in that digital space?
Well, there's never been a better time for it, is the good news. And I think Nevena's story about Climate 5 and just jumping on Instagram and how they're able to leverage that, leverage a moment, being the bushfires and people's desire to help, and turn that into millions of dollars divested from superannuation, is extraordinary. But yeah, like people, all of us have become just like, so I don't want to say addicted, because it's very, it's like a loaded term, but we love content. Most people just, it's like gimme, stories, content. We're like scrolling and looking for these sorts of stories on social media in particular all the time. And so, social media is a really obvious way of getting stories out there, particularly if it's on video. It's very easy to cut together little videos now. But one piece of it, if someone was listening to this call is genuinely like, oh, I really want to, I don't know, like the local pool wants to close down the hydrotherapy pool, and I know all these people with a disability or elderly people who use that pool. I really want to sort of like get some public support for the hydrotherapy pool. I'm just making up this example. But you know, my advice would be to like not overcook things like this. Like, you don't need a production company, you wouldn't need scripts, you don't need to sort of scaffold these sorts of personal stories with too much. You can grab a mobile phone and have a chat to people, and it's usually those sort of organic that organic content that resonates with audiences anyway, because if it's too polished and too shiny, people think that's not very grassroots, is it? Like, particularly if you're an organization who's seeking to fundraise, like you can't ask people to like give money, like give their hard-earned money to this grassroots thing and then show them, you know, a website and a video that looks like it's cost $50,000. Yeah, so my advice would be to just like not overthink it, and also that you'd be surprised just how many people want to hear stories like this.
How does that resonate with you, Marc? Like, as somebody who is working for somewhere that also needs to produce a lot of content, I know that I've seen some of the long reads that you have worked on. How do you approach so many different types of content that you could be creating at the newsroom?
I think there's just sort of, it's an acceptance that you can't get to everything that you'd like to get to. You know, you have to be picky and you have to turn things down, and it's never personal. It's just sort of whatever the workload or the timeframes of the day are. But I think that, you know, on the issue we were talking about earlier in terms of those relationships, the more regularly those relationships are kept up, the better the chance that something will come across my desk and I'll finally be like, actually, I do have time today to look into this, or actually, I was just thinking about this issue last week and I was going to, you know, message you about it or whatever. Yeah, I also think that in terms of, from my perspective, as a journalist, you know, it doesn't take a lot of a budget to reach out to me. It's, you know, it's an email or a phone call and a conversation, rather than sort of needing a sort of slickly produced pitch document or a fresh report on this or that. So yeah.
Nevena, how do you see some of those tools changing, particularly in the social space? Like, you talked about Instagram being the focus for Climate 5. How do you think that is evolving with new platforms coming into the market? Like, what's in your toolkit now?
In my toolkit, and I was going to jump in, and it's something that Sally and Marc have both resonated on, creativity and being genuine will always, well, not always, in the majority of times, trump having a really big budget. So as Sally said, being able to be a storyteller, a genuine storyteller, having someone, you know, having Bev from your local pub talking about why it's so important that we have the kids area there away from the pokies is going to be so much more compelling than watching a $300,000 produced ad on, you know, trying to sell me X. So no matter the platform that we're using, whether we're moving and migrating to TikTok, whether we're investigating whether, you know, whether it's appropriate for us to set up a brand Twitter, that is not going to change. Those toolkits that we have are universal and work across the different platforms. It's just a matter of adapting them to the particular audience that we're talking to and making sure that they're suitable for our channel. But we can make that dollar go really far and make change happen for the better by using our hearts and our minds at the same times. And it is a little corny, but I think the combination of those two things and a little bit of luck, not to sound like a bumper sticker, but that's when magic happens.
There was lots of bumper stickers in there. I loved it. Amy, what do you see about those different platforms? Like, what relationship do you see about what traction different platforms might have in the media, or contrasting social platforms and the conversation that's happening there versus traditional media?
It's always really interesting to compare and contrast the difference in conversation between traditional media and social media when looking at sort of a specific topic or a specific campaign. Quite often you'll see that, you know, the most visible conversations or most visible posts, if you like, tend to be coming from traditional media, actually, where, you know, articles are being posted across Facebook or Twitter, for example. But the reactions can often be quite different. And, you know, we can have a look at audiences in order to see, you know, how did the different audiences respond here? Because it's exactly that. It's taking your strategy, adapting it to those different channels, but seeing what works well and what doesn't work well across those channels using data as well. You know, some of the first reactors to any kind of story is going to be online media in this day and age, and it is often going to be social media as well. So, you know, how does your strategy need to then adapt in order to sort of make sure that you're servicing all of the different channels, I think. But it's always quite interesting to compare not only the different audiences across traditional versus social, but the different channels within them, because you know, the users of Twitter are very different to those of TikTok.
Absolutely. I'm just keeping an eye on our questions area. We've got a few people who are saying the session's been really informative and how good it is to get just ideas around campaign tactics and best practice. So thank you to everybody who's left a note in there. We are running into the last 5 minutes of the session. So if you did have a question for anyone on the panel today, look for that question mark icon and I'll make sure we get to it in the next 4 minutes now, or before we wrap up today. Nevena, you were just nodding while Amy was talking there at the end. What was resonating about traditional and social conversations for you?
In the relationship between them. So if you aren't necessarily able to have a bigger media team to pitch to your Marcs of the world and get that story breaking through, one of the things that we can do is repurpose those as, you know, campaign pieces or communication tactics where we can talk about the issue through our lens or through our frame. So in reusing the story and making sure that we're not using our opponent's language or frame, that we're very much speaking our language. We're speaking for our campaign purposes. It's just something that we've been able to use free of charge. Well, you know, someone gets a profit out of it, but for us it's free and it gives us a powerful platform to bounce off of and gets people the moment to engage, because while they might not read the article, they can certainly read the headline and react from there.
Awesome. We've got one question coming through, and Nevena, I might throw this to you first and then to you, Sally. Would you engage with social influencers to drive this social change? And if so, how would you monitor the quality of that engagement?
Social influencers, much like traditional media, we use them because they have access to a really large audience. Anytime I have worked with them, I try and engage on a pro bono basis because usually we don't have the budget to do so. But just be really clear as to what outcomes you're trying to achieve with this person. If it's a day of significance, make sure that they're connected to that, because otherwise it can seem really disingenuous for a person who has no connection to a particular issue, a particular campaign, to be able to speak on behalf of or about. And when you are working with them, just have a real understanding of what you're trying to achieve out of this. Sally?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I do and would engage influencers like where appropriate. I think like in the past I haven't, and I wouldn't if it was a really like sensitive issue, or yeah, if it was like, but basically like influencers are going to be a massive value add to the sort of amplification strategy of your campaign, if this campaign can be like adapted into their language for their audience. Like if it's the type of campaign where you set a sort of central goal and a couple of key messages and relinquish control of how that message is told to different audiences, then they can be fantastic. So for example, in the same-sex marriage campaign, there was no point like trying to centrally control any of the messages around that. And also I don't think that would have been right to do or strategic. So that's the perfect type of campaign to give influencers, you know, a couple of bits of collateral and some, you know, key lines with a few dates or whatever if they want to use it, and then see what people create. But if it was a more tricky, sensitive topic, then yeah, I think to Nevena's point, like their influencers' audiences will know if it's just a post that they've been given about a topic that they're not really engaged in, and so that'll mean that the post will either just flop because people won't be engaging with it, and it'll also be incongruous with like the rest of this person's content. And also, yeah, as Nevena mentions, there's this risk of people being like, why are you posting about International Day for whatever when you've never cared about this before? So yeah, it's like big yes with a little caveat.
Big yes with a little caveat. I reckon we've got time for half another question. Amy, I just wanted to see if you had any quick thoughts on how you would measure the quality of that influencer content on social.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think quality is a really key thing there. It's not just about getting, just a mention. It's about, really driving home like the messages behind the story. I think it's important to have a look at the reaction to that kind of as it's happening, and in case, there are some red flags that are occurring, and there's different maybe audiences of that influencer might be then spinning off the story into different conversations. So I think monitoring that throughout. But I was kind of sort of agreeing so much with what you were both saying there, because I think tailoring what you're doing, to go back to my earlier point as well, I guess, is so important, and you can use data to do that as well. So before ahead of time, understand who their audience is and what kind of things they talk about a lot, and ultimately that's kind of what data is there for, is to help you to kind of to tailor what it is that you want to do to different audiences. So it can be really powerful, both looking back and looking forward as well.
Amazing. That is a wonderful point to end on. Thank you so much to all of our panelists today for their stories around the simplicity of storytelling, the ability of everyday people or people in any role with any budget to enact social change. I've really enjoyed this conversation. This is our last iSentia conversation, our last iSentia introducing Pulsar before the end of the year. So we'll see you soon again in the new year after the holiday break. But thank you all for being here. Thank you to our amazing panelists, and thank you for giving me lots to think about. Have an awesome rest of your day, and thank you so much. See you later. Bye.